This story starts 5 years ago, but it goes back 10. 5 years ago, I was driving through a college town in western Pennsylvania with a coworker when she pointed at a row of apartment buildings, fairly newer, and she stated that, supposedly those apartment buildings there are haunted. That building A there in particular, somebody told me once when I was attending here a couple years ago that a handyman had died in there unexpectedly, and that you can hear him banging around on the first floor apartment. Now, I was a bit taken aback, and I didn't say anything for a little while because I had lived in that apartment. In fact, I was one of the first 4 residences there, and I was very well aware of the handyman. And what shook me up wasn't the closeness, and it wasn't the ghost story itself, but as in every other instance, I had experienced a ghost story for looking for it. And here I was finding myself thrust in not only into a ghost story, but really into the very origins, the navel of that ghost story. This evening's story is a 3-part triptych, and the first part really begins with 3 close friends of mine, those being Michael, Greg, and Brendan. Brendan, in fact, is the person who edits and produces this audio that you're hearing right now. The 3 of them moved into this brand new apartment on a country road that buttressed the campus of a state university in western Pennsylvania. The day they moved in, Greg had noted that the hot water tank wasn't working, and he had contacted the handyman for the apartment building. Was there when the guy came in, and Greg had asked the guy just to make sure that the lights were off when he left, and that was it. Mike and I at that time had a band, and we were playing a show in a town called Elwood City over in the Beaver, Lawrence County area in the westernmost area of Pennsylvania, and Greg happened to be at that show. He left before Mike was able to, and he got back to the apartment when he noticed that the door was ajar, and he was upset to find that the light was out. And at first he offered the man a drink and then asked him if he needed any help, but then he realized that the man was very dead. If I can remember correctly, he had died of a heart attack, and he lay in the out on the porch and he lay towards the living room, close to where Greg's closet was. Now, Mike, Brendan, and Greg lived in that apartment for a little while, and I, being somewhat angry and disillusioned, was up north attending a fairly prestigious private college in that area, and I was kind of between places. I crashed there at the apartment a couple times shortly after the whole episode, and by November of that year I found myself moving in, having left that college and leaving behind sort of the dreams I had of becoming a linguistics professor and moving on to the Ivy League, not because I wasn't academically achieving it, but because I was directionless and kind of stupid, and really didn't have the money to realize that at the time. And so I resigned myself to maybe going and getting a teaching certificate, one that I used very briefly. So I moved in with Greg, Mike, and Brendan, and I, at the time, probably wasn't the best roommate. I'm not a particularly good model for cohabitation, and I am finding myself apologizing to people for that. After 10 years, I still apologize to those 3, and I apologize still to the roommate I had before then, and regardless, I find myself living with them, and I'm now thrust in the middle of the story. When I moved in, the other 3 were away on the winter holiday, and so I was by myself. That winter it was unseasonably warm, and I had found a job at the University Auto Garage. The university at the time maintained, well, at the time that I was employed there, maintained 147 different vehicles, including police cars and golf carts, and there was a wrecker that I got to drive, and I love driving it, except for when I'd have to reverse myself in order to get cars up on the lift, because the manual was it was a manual transmission, and though I can drive a manual well, it was a big vehicle, and I was never wholly comfortable with going and backing up into vehicles in that thing. Anyhow, my car died. Again, I was very broke, and I had a very broken, beaten Jetta with it was bad to the point where I took the passenger seat out of the front because the back doors were welded shut, and in order to more easily fit people in, I took that seat out, but also my hockey equipment fit in there best that way because the trunk didn't lock anyway, so I didn't like keeping it in there. There was a crank moon roof, and when it would rain, the water would pour in from the ceiling, and it was just in a bad shape, and it was really no surprise when one day I found it wouldn't start anymore. And so I would have to walk the 1.5 miles over to the university garage every morning. But it wasn't really that big a problem because it was an unseasonably warm winter, and I do have memories of, 10 years ago now, back in 2005, of walking down in a t-shirt, and my routine during the break would be me getting up in the morning in the apartment by myself, unlocking my bedroom door and running into the shower and locking that and running into the kitchen, making something to eat, and then going back into my room, locking myself in, eating something real quick before walking the 1.5 miles over to the garage. With the winter months and it being dark out by 5:30, I would get done with work around 4 usually, and then I would go over to the library before they closed for holiday hours around 4:30, and I would sometimes get some books. And then I would walk back to the apartment, and I would get something to eat very quickly, sometimes shower, and then I would go into my room, and I would lock myself in, and I normally wouldn't leave unless I had to go to the bathroom because, as the old Edgar Allan Poe line goes, I've not believe in ghosts, but I've lived in fear of them all my life. The bottom of it is, at the time I was pretty young and I wasn't in the best situation, and I was alone in this gigantic building that was new and all the time settling, and so there would be weird and unfamiliar noises, and just the settling noises of a newly constructed building, and coupling that with the knowledge of what have occurred there, plus just that sort of shining moment when you realize you're in this big massive space by yourself. I kept to this routine fairly regularly, and every night when I would go to sleep I would either turn on my old TV, which was an old portable model from the 80s with it had built-in aerials and a handle on the top of the set, and I could get 2 stations. I got WKBN, and I would watch Jeopardy every night while I ate. I would either go to sleep every night with the TV or the radio on, and that way if I heard a weird noise that would creep me out otherwise, I could dismiss it in the middle of the night as having come from one of those sources. This continued on for a while, and then after the end of the Christmas break, Mike and Greg moved back. And when Mike and Greg moved back, I wasn't as restricted to this routine I had set up for myself, so that I could avoid having to think much about what had occurred there. Again, not as much because I was afraid of death or what had occurred, but because I was afraid of what my imagination would do if I dwelt upon it, and so I would try to limit myself as I had. But now being able to interact with other people and with the building filling up now that school was back in session, it put my mind at ease. But we did occasionally talk about it. We never experienced anything particularly unsettling when we were all 3 there together. Greg had even made a crocheted cross, and he said it was to make up for the fact that anytime anybody would irritate him around the apartment, he would, quote, threaten to bring the count up to 2, quote. When I was 6 years old, my friend Brandon and I had found my next door neighbor dead in his bathtub. The reason why we were in his house is another story. But the thing I remember most about it when I think back on it now is that I never had any nightmares about finding him or about him, except for one which came about years later, and the memory I have of it involves sleeping bags and crab apples, and I can't really remember much else. So the true terror that I felt that evening has been lost over the years, and so I don't think it was particularly consequential. However, the other thing I know about that is that the stories of that man who sold so much of his farmland off and built the houses that I and a couple of my friends grew up in, the stories grew out of that man, but none about how he died. We moved out of that apartment in the middle of the summer. I lingered on the longest because everybody else had gone home, and I really wasn't particularly comfortable doing that, and I had a girlfriend at the time who was coming over. It was nice to be able to fall back into the routine that I established during the winter break. But the fact of the matter is that by the time fall came around again, I was living in a house on the other side of town, a bit further from the campus, and everybody else had moved out of the apartment too. And though we had discussions about what had transpired in our apartment between the four of us, I don't remember there ever being any other conversation with the other people living in the building, although we didn't really associate with anybody but the people across the way. It seemed to me that this story was somehow intimately ours, not only because we were the first people living in that apartment, but we were also, Greg in particular, was the first person in that building, and I certainly, of that first year of people, spent the most time there. Also, I feel it was the most intimately our story, and one that we kept within our circle of friends, because of my involvement at the garage. And while I worked at the university garage, and as I got more comfortable with the people there, it turned out that they were aware of this fellow, and when they learned where I was living, they opened up about him, and apparently he was a pretty nice guy. And as I said earlier, through the entire time that we were living there, there was never anything unsettling, spooky that occurred, other than the events that we conjured up in our imagination. And so we kind of forgot about it as an experience, and we remember it only as a singular incident among us, and we occasionally bring it up. But there's no real stories beyond the origin. And that's why when I was driving in that car with somebody from my office 5 years ago, in 2010, I was really surprised to hear that a ghost story had come out of it, because again, I had been in this same sort of situation at least once before and never had experienced this. And knowing that it's tied to the university makes me think that this is going to be a story that's going to be changing an awful lot over the years, and it's not going to go away because of its connection to the college. And it makes me wonder about my own mortality in a way, because at some point Greg, Mike, Brendan, and myself are going to be a very real part of that legend and that myth, and how are we going to be portrayed in that story? What will our role be? Will we always be the integral part of this ghost story that we were in the real story, the real incident? Since I was first made aware that this ghost story had been circulating around the campus, I always listened for it when I listened to the younger people at work. The field I'm in oftentimes hires young people right out of college. And I always like to pick their brain, not only because I love hearing a good ghost story, which should be of no surprise to anybody, but because I feel like I have a responsibility to my friends to be constantly monitoring whatever role that we are going to play in the mythology of Pennsylvania.